Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to lesson number 3 in Unit 1 of Social Studies 8 for the first trimester, Birth of a Nation. This is our third lesson explaining how the 13 colonies began in America and how the American Revolution took place and the consequences of that. And today we're going to focus on something important. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it, but it's important that you understand that this occurred and you understand what the consequences of it were. So, our essential question for today is, how did conflict between European nations lead to tension in the 13 colonies? And this is part 1. Part 2 is coming soon to a classroom near you. And what we're learning about today is called the French-Indian War. And it's a confusing title because actually it was the French and most Native American tribes against the British, also known as the English, and a couple of Native American tribes. But that's a very long title, so calling it the French-Indian War is what historians have decided to do. Another piece to know is that the French-Indian War was only part of a larger war that was taking place largely around the world. In fact, many people call this the First World War. And so when we're talking about the French-Indian War, we're talking about the portion of the war that took place in North America. So this war, which is also sometimes called the 7-Year War, occurred between 1764 and 1763, which is 9 years. So, there you go. England and France fought a war in North America and other parts of the world. So, the 9 years part of it took place more in the rest of the world. And the reason this war took place in North America was because basically the British and the French were fighting for who was going to be able to colonize territory west of the Appalachian Mountains. As I said in the beginning, it was known in North America as the French-Indian War because the French were allied with most of the Native American tribes against the British. The couple of tribes that did ally themselves with the British did so because they essentially wanted to wipe out and defeat other tribes that they were in competition with and had historical conflict with. So they were fighting over an area called the Ohio River Valley. So if you are looking on this map, the Ohio River Valley is this area where you see kind of the blue and red stripes. And that's the area where, Ohio and Kentucky are today in modern day United States. The French pretty much had colonies in what we now know as Canada, especially the province of Quebec, and the British had the 13 colonies along the Atlantic coast, but the 13 colonies pretty much ended at what's known as the Appalachian Mountains, which is this area right here. And so the British were wanting to push westward across the Appalachian Mountains, and they viewed the French as being in their way. And of course, as often was the case in the colonial period, Native Americans were kind of caught in the middle and needed to choose what for them was the least worst option. And most of them chose the French because the French were actually a lot more respectful towards Native Americans and Native American culture than the British were. The French were fur trappers and not farmers, and so the French pretty much left the land intact. They didn't chop down all the trees. They didn't plant farms the way the British did. The British tended to shoot first and ask questions later, and they saw the Native Americans as kind of being in their way, whereas the French, because they were more respectful, were welcomed into Native American villages and often even were permitted to marry Native American women as kind of a sign of peace. So, very different cultural attitudes towards the Native Americans depending on whether it was the French or the British in question, which is why most Native Americans allied themselves with the French. The British, like I said before, wanted to start moving west from the 13 colonies and start colonizing areas further inland from the Atlantic Ocean. and they basically saw the French were in their way. And it was actually during this war that a young George Washington, who was actually working for the British and working within the British Army, fought on the side of the British in this war. The younger version of George Washington wanted to be seen as a capable leader and warrior within the British military, and that was kind of challenging at the time because the British kind of looked down their noses at people from the colonies as being lesser than actual British soldiers from England. And George Washington was trying to cut his stripes and show that he had what it took to be a good British soldier. And he did distinguish himself and gain a lot of military experience during the French and Indian War. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the details of the French and Indian War, so it's really more important that we focus on the actual consequences of the French and Indian War, because in terms of the 13 colonies, honestly, that's what matters most. So on the next slide, that's what we're going to do. So what were the effects of the French and Indian War? Let's cut to the chase. What was the end result? In the end, the British won the war and defeated France. The British lost quite a few battles at the beginning of the war, but they won most of the battles at the end of the war, and France was defeated, and essentially the British got what they want. France was forced to give up what is now Canada, and the British gained influence over all of North America west to the Mississippi River. So if you look at this map over here, everything you see in pink and red, at least by treaty and by understanding between the French and the British, became British territory to be colonized. The areas in red actually were colonized by the British. The areas in pink were gained by the British after the French Indian War. And there were multiple consequences to this for the people who lived in the territories that were conquered by France. As you know, or maybe you don't, 1 in 3 Canadians speaks French, and that goes back to the legacy of the French in Canada. The British allowed them to keep the Catholic faith. The British allowed them to keep their language, did not force them to assimilate, and so that set the precedent for the French citizens of that area to accept British rule. And then there is a large French-speaking population in Louisiana called Cajuns. They originally came from Acadia, which is basically today's Maine and New Brunswick in Canada, and they were literally forcibly removed by the British from Maine and New Brunswick down to Louisiana, which is where the Cajun population of Louisiana came from. So the main thing I want you to know about this is the British won the war, the British gained control over all this territory, but in so doing, England went into a great deal of debt. War costs money. The British spent a lot of money trying to win this war, and that changed the basic relationship between the British and the 13 colonies, because before the French Indian War, the 13 colonies were mostly left alone to govern themselves as long as they sent the raw materials back to England that England wanted, and as long as they bought British goods. Other than that, the British were pretty much happy to let the colonies govern themselves. And what changed after the French Indian War is that the British went into debt during the war, and so they started to ask a lot more of people from the 13 colonies. And if you know and understand that, you will be ready and receptive to what's coming up in the next lesson, where we talk about how tensions started to develop between the people living in the 13 colonies and their British overlords in England. But for today, we're going to call that the end for the notes. In class, I am about to show you this video where you will be writing a summary not so much a summary as I would like you to take at least 3 notes from this video. It's a summary of the French Indian War. So 3 new facts that maybe you didn't get from my brief explanation. The video is about 11 minutes long, and as long as you write down 3 new facts from this video, you're in good shape. And I'll show the video in class. I'm not going to show it as part of the YouTube lesson. So for now, as far as this YouTube lesson goes, this is Mr. Blumendahl signing off until next time on the Waldo Middle School Social Studies YouTube Network.